Welcome to Unit 5 of EDSE 512. There's a lot to cover in this unit, so we'll get started. Nice job wrapping up that case study part 1. That really is a fundamental assignment as we get going on the 4-part case study, and we will have our part 2 due in this unit, the final day of the unit at 11:59 p.m. Mountain Standard, per usual. So please do make sure that you get that in. Let me know if you have any concerns about that deadline or any questions about the assignment. So as you can see, we'll be talking about the special education process as well as evaluation. We talked about consent for evaluation in the previous unit, and that's part 1. But now we're going to be moving into the evaluation process itself. So your assigned reading will be out of the procedural manual, which is linked in Canvas. And there is not a discussion for this unit. Just really keep that focus on part 2 of the case study. So Unit 5, we've got our graphic organizer. And as you will notice, there is a lot of content. As I mentioned, there's a lot of content in this unit. So we will talk through it together. And then you can also be sure to take a look at these PowerPoints by yourselves. As mentioned, the information is in procedural manual, but it may be helpful to you to see it here in PowerPoint format. So for this lecture, we are talking about initial evaluation. Some of you had really good ideas about what we need to test for the case studies. It's really important to think about the whole student as we work through this, not just academics. What could be going on? And obviously, ultimately, the issue of concern is academic access, but we want to make sure that we're examining all sides, figuring out what could be impacting the student's ability to access the general education curriculum without additional support. So what's going on? What are the needs? Don't be afraid to evaluate in multiple areas. And you may think, oh, well, this is just going to be more and more work. Yes, that is often correct, but that's the reason for a multidisciplinary team. And in order to create an effective IEP, you really do need to do that comprehensive evaluation. 1, for legal compliance, and 2, because if your evaluation is not sufficient and comprehensive, you will be back to the drawing board because the plan that you have in place for the student likely will not work out because all of the needs are not being addressed. So do take the time to look through here. Obviously, we go through evaluation. We then would meet all together, multidisciplinary team. Typically at this time, those are virtual. So there's some flexibility in format there. And at that time, the child would be determined eligible or ineligible for special education services based on the results of the comprehensive evaluation. And then at that time, an IEP should be developed, and that IEP should be individualized based on the results of that evaluation, where the needs and the areas for growth are indicated, the impact of the disability is indicated, and an IEP can be crafted that targets those needs, areas for growth with goals and accommodations, and it clearly indicates all present levels of performance. So you're then providing the services, checking for progress. We've talked a lot about progress monitoring in this course. And if things aren't working, we do need to come back to the drawing board. That is the main idea of progress monitoring. And you will be able to access these procedural guidance documents via the Canvas shell. So even if you don't live in Colorado, we are working with Colorado documents, and that's just for consistency of format. You'll find that these generally have the same main ideas regardless of where you are living or working, but for the sake of consistency, we will be using Colorado forms. So in Canvas, if you look through critical documents, you'll find some very important links and PDF files that will be helpful to you not only now, but throughout the course. When we're talking about procedural guidance, you can find this in PDF format, and it is linked right here through the course shell. So I would encourage you all to take a look at that document and read through it. Take the time to at least just skim and browse, because that content is going to be valuable as you're working on your case study. Moving back to the Unit 5 content, I'm going to talk through some ideas regarding student involvement, prior written notice, a very important part of the IEP. This is a document, alphabet soup. Some of these have been updated or are slightly different or adjusted, particularly in the state of Colorado. For instance, ED, instead we would say SED, which stands for serious emotional disability. So some of these have been changed and updated, but the thing that we want to recall as we look through this is how a parent would feel. Because even though a few of these acronyms have been updated, for instance, positive behavioral supports now would be referenced as PBIS rather than PBS, a parent oftentimes feels so confused and stressed hearing all of these acronyms. And many of us, even those who have been in the field for years, don't necessarily know all of these acronyms. So it's unfair and inappropriate to expect that a parent or a guardian would be fluent in these. Please consider saying the words out loud rather than throwing around acronyms when you're in an IEP meeting, when you're writing a consent. Make sure that it's something that a person who is not in undergraduate or graduate programming to study special education could comprehend and understand without feeling confusion or stress. Information about involving the family. This is really important. The student can be involved as early and as thoroughly as possible. Obviously, legally, when we're working with 15 plus IEPs, students need to be there, or at least to be invited and strongly encouraged to be there. But even at a younger age, doing student interviews, walking through accommodations document, talking through them with the student, having the student provide input, or even come in for part of the meeting, any of that could be appropriate. I've seen it go quite smoothly and positively in middle school. I've seen students create PowerPoint presentations about themselves and their needs. The sky is really the limit when it comes to student involvement in the IEP meeting. So take the time to get creative about that. Consider, regardless of the student and that student's levels of functioning, how can interests, needs, and input be taken into consideration thoroughly and respectfully. So a student may be referred for evaluation for special education. This arrow here is a helpful visual. You may be working with the response to intervention or MTSS team, identifying that a student is not responding. For instance, we think about those students who are in our case study that has been provided, the 2 different case studies. And we may also have a parent who requests an evaluation because the student is doing poorly and that there have been interventions that have been tried, etc. So once a student comes in with a referral for special education evaluation, you'll go through the consent just as you did for case study project 1. Then we've got to get through that evaluation, send a notice of meeting along with the procedural safeguards for parents or guardians. And at that meeting, we'll walk through the evaluation. Then you'll need to determine eligibility for special education and receive parent consent for provision of those services. Make sure that they have the procedural safeguards. You always in the IEP have to put that the family has received them. And then you'll also hold an IEP meeting. You have 30 days in most situations for this to occur. This may happen at the same meeting as the evaluation, but oftentimes may be scheduled for a second meeting. So it just depends on the timing and the situation. So prior written notice, this is information, basically a form that must be filled out and documentation must be provided if an action is going to be taken by the school district. So for instance, if a student was offered in-person school attendance, but the family determined due to health concerns or other reasons that the student would be doing fully remote learning, then a prior written notice document must be provided to the family explaining the potential impact of this decision on special education services, or the presence of the student at school in general. And then the document would say that the parents are aware of this, that it has been discussed, that they've agreed to it. That's an example of a document that can be sent home. So prior written notice will be used for when a special education evaluation is beginning and consent is obtained. It'll also be used for several other things, like the example that I just gave. It might be used if there's an adjustment made or an amendment made to the IEP, or if special education transportation is added when it wasn't before. That might be something that could show up. So really anything that is being changed or adjusted, this is a way to get parental consent and to make sure that families are clear on any actions being taken that involve the education of the child. This is something that we worked through for the case study. The notice of meeting document. This is a very important one to send home, so do make it as detailed as possible. Families appreciate getting this document ahead of time. It's also a good reminder for you because you then can send out procedural safeguards and any other relevant documentation when you send out that notice of meeting. So evaluation, obviously, this is A, to identify whether a child has a disability and is eligible for special education services, and then B, to determine what the needs of that child are. So the evaluation will show us what category might be appropriate for eligibility for the student, if any. Please remember the concept of predetermination. It is possible, although not extremely common, it is possible that a student would be evaluated for eligibility for special education services and would not be eligible. Generally, if we've come to the point of referral and evaluation, so many things have been tried and things are going badly enough that there is a significant support need and the student is not successful with general education alone. And so that's why, for the most part, you may see that eligibility is determined, but we can never make that assumption because there are situations in which it will not be. And here there are many different categories under which a student can be eligible for special education. The forms that were provided when we do determine eligibility, we have to go through and identify many different answers to questions related to the disability that we choose. So we first have to say, yes, our evaluation is comprehensive. No, the student cannot receive educational benefit from general ed alone. And then go through and demonstrate in the document that the disability, for instance, if a student is becoming eligible for a specific learning disability, is not due to lack of appropriate instruction, is not due to lack of proficiency in English or the language that is spoken in the school, is not due to lack of this or that factor. Social maladjustment is one that's considered for serious emotional disability. So we'll go through and make sure that we've taken those other variables into consideration. Documentation is key. Put all of your progress monitoring in a database. And this is a valuable page if the IEP is not working. That is a time to often restart with an evaluation and make sure that the placement is appropriate, make sure that the services in place don't need to be perhaps increased or changed. We can always go back to the drawing board. We want to do our best to get it right in the first place, but there is room to reevaluate if something changes or it's not working. The alternate standards or extended evidence outcomes are used for students who have significant disabilities. This generally would be students with intellectual disabilities. They may be a part of significant support needs programming. You can look through them here on the website for Colorado Department of Education.